What is culturally responsive pedagogy? Culturally responsive pedagogy facilitates and supports the achievement of all students. In a culturally responsive classroom, effective teaching and learning occur in a culturally supported, learner-centered context whereby the strengths students bring to school are identified, nurtured, and utilized to promote student achievement. Well, who's a culturally responsive teacher? What we've seen is that culturally responsive teachers first engage in reflective thinking and writing about their own values, motivations, and behavior. They explore their own personal and family histories, as well as acknowledge the membership in the different groups to which they belong. They learn about the history and experiences of other diverse groups, including those groups from which your students come from. They visit their students' families and learn about their communities and take part in community activities. They may also visit or read about successful teachers in diverse settings to see what is it that makes them so successful in working across cultures. And they develop not only an appreciation for diversity, but really become involved in appreciating, in nurturing, and in encouraging diversity. And they participate in reforming the institution. That is, they advocate for their students. In 2004, James Banks constructed a cultural competence continuum. And on this slide, you'll see 5 bullet points. But if we start at the bottom of the slide, that's the beginning of this continuum. At the bottom of the continuum might be people that could be called cultural destructiveness. They're at that level when they intentionally maintain inequality and inequity between groups. An example of that might be the Ku Klux Klan. The next level of cultural incapacity is where people or an individual may not intentionally try to segregate, but that they appreciate the status quo. They don't want to rock the boat. They like things the way they are. The third level on this continuum is cultural blindness, where people express a philosophy of being non-biased. So you might hear people say, well, I don't have any biases towards any group because my parents taught me to treat everybody the same. And that's what we call cultural blindness because, in fact, not every group needs the same. And sometimes to create balance and equity, some groups might need something different. So that's the third bullet point. It's better than the bottom of the continuum, but there still are places to continue on this continuum here. The fourth bullet, basic cultural competence. Now that's where we begin to accept and respect differences and recognize the need for systemic change. So some advocacy, beginning to see that maybe really we're not treating every group fairly and we need to take part in not maintaining the status quo, sticking our neck out to make some changes. But what we aim for here on this cultural continuum is the fifth bullet point, advanced cultural competence. And this is where individuals hold everyone's culture in high esteem. There's ongoing individual and institutional change to address inequity based on informed decision making. So this is really getting the picture that it will take investment by individuals as well as institutions to make change. So hopefully that gives us an idea of figuring out where we're at in this continuum and then where we would like to move to. So let's look at some common characteristics of culturally responsive practices. The school climate would be one of caring, respect, and valuing of all the students' cultures. Bridges are built between academic learning and students' prior experiences, knowledge, native language, and values. In other words, what children bring to school with them are not asked to be left outside the school door, but instead they're welcomed in with all of their diverse learning experiences, languages, cultural backgrounds, and values. And we use those to build on. All stakeholders have high expectations for students and expect them to achieve high standards. So everybody at the school would understand that no matter what the child comes in with in terms of their prior experiences, that we want to aim high for them and help support them to achieve at high levels. Effective classroom practices are challenging, cooperative, and hands-on with less emphasis on rote memorization and lecture formats. So again, we're looking at ways of engaging all of our students. School staff build trust and partnerships with families, and especially families marginalized by schools in the past. That might mean thinking outside the box sometimes, and perhaps scheduling conferences or family meetings at non-traditional times, because many of families of ELL students work jobs in which they're not necessarily given time off or have paid vacation days to come in to do conferences. So we found systems that have flexed some time and made conferences on Saturdays or late into the evenings that would be make it so that families are able to participate in school functions. Now, culturally responsive practice also looks at students' heritage culture and realize that there's really this tug of war going on when children enter American schools and their culture is not necessarily valued. So similar to the dynamic that can occur when parents use their native language and students respond in English because they know English is the language of power, fractured loyalties can occur between the home culture and the dominant culture for students. Students sometimes may begin to see their home culture as low status, yet they may want to maintain that connection between their home culture and the school culture and see their place in both cultures, but that's not necessarily reinforced by their school. So these fractured loyalties that sometimes children feel they have to make this choice can contribute to confusion and alienation that may lead to investment in negative subcultures. And we see examples of those subcultures such as gangs. So many of these, another way of calling them would be shallow urban youth cultural groups, are formed so that students can create an identity because everybody needs a place to belong. So what's a requirement for a culturally responsive classroom? Well, you need deep knowledge of all your cultural groups and to have a commitment to establishing strong relationships between all groups, between teachers in the school, students and their families, as well as the broader communities. And it takes some skill, but mostly desire, to build the bridges between school and the communities, and using an extensive variety of instructional strategies and knowing your students and see how they're responding to the variety of instructional strategies to make sure that you're able to hook all students into the learning process. So to do that, here are a few questions that you might ask yourself. What kinds of diverse perspectives and experiences will students bring to the class? How can I assess students' prior knowledge of race, class, gender, experiences, school experiences, knowledge of the world? How can I incorporate diverse voices without only relying on students to speak for different groups? So that is looking outside the box once again. Instead of having the student from India being the only one that talks about that cultural group, where can we get other experts to come in and help us learn about our students' backgrounds? How will my own characteristic and background affect the learning environment? We all come in with our own values, mores, as well as some biases. And first examining what those are in ourselves will help us be able to have a smoother classroom as we're working across culture. Ask yourself, will some students see me as a role model more readily than others? And how can I teach to all students? And I think that's really the critical questions. How do I make those connections to all of my students? And that really comes down to knowing each one of your students personally. So you may wonder about selecting materials and activities. So it's important to really look at examining traditions and ways of viewing the world that enable students to recognize their prior knowledge and what is being taught. So you need to, carefully examine materials prior to using them, even though you may have purchased them from a catalog that says multicultural literature. Really take a glance at them before to see how they are showing perspectives and making sure that there's, equality in the materials that we're using, and looking at how to integrate the materials so it's not an add-on, so that we don't talk about and teach about mainstream American culture, and then, by the way, let's add this little piece of a Cinco de Mayo event and do some cooking and maybe do some artwork. We need to get more deeply involved in students' cultures by understanding their world views. So some ideas for teaching and about different countries and cultures is, give students the opportunity to use pen pals, and perhaps that the pen pals can be facilitated by students in your classroom, perhaps friends or families that they may have in different countries. Certainly read books and pictures about different countries and cultures and have them well represented in your classes. Have students journal about the differences and similarities between their cultures and countries. Explore perspectives of historical events, wars, and other important points in history, to show students that there are always different perspectives that are, and we value those. And have families share traditional stories, folklore, and myth, and use those as some points of literature. To leave you with a quote by Shana Ritter, written in 2007, "Gaining cultural competence is a developmental process which begins with the awareness of one's own culture, gaining knowledge of other cultures, and understanding the way different values intersect. As we move along the cultural continuum and gain proficiency, we deepen our understanding of inequity and our ability to help create equity, and that's our goal, is to create equitable educational systems."